everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. This is Mariana speaking, and you are listening to another episode of A Perspective. Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing great. I've missed you. If you're new here, welcome, and if you're not new, welcome back to another episode of the podcast. I want to take a second to apologize that I didn't upload anything last week. I was just not in the headspace. I was pretty burnt out from all my studying during the week, and I just felt like I needed a couple days to kind of get my thoughts together and really put together something that was going to be meaningful and something that reflected what I felt like I needed to say. So sorry for the little hiatus and the fact that there was no episode last week, but I'm back. I'm excited. It feels great to be talking to you guys again, and I'm excited to dive into today's episode. Before getting into any content though, I do want to take a second to acknowledge that I am recording this episode from the unceded traditional territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, Stalo, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam peoples, whose relationship with the land stands to this day, and I want to acknowledge that I am very grateful to be on this land and recording this episode from this beautiful space. So today's episode, as you may have gathered from the podcast title, is about anger. And we are going to be talking about what anger is and what anger isn't, and how we can use anger as an emotional tool to serve us on our path to pursuing our goals and our ambitions versus letting it serve as something that defeats us and something that just ruins our day. Because I think that anger is an emotion that has a lot of negative connotation associated with it. I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that when we think of anger, we think of, aggression and temperament, and, we think of the person with steam blowing out of their ears, when it can be very depictive of what anger is, but we also have to realize that a lot of those things we see, like aggression and the steam blown out of the ears and the lashing out, are responses that are guided by anger when we let the anger control us and when we let the anger dictate what the response is going to be. And what I really want to get into in this episode is how we can take a moment to gather ourselves and choose an appropriate response to the circumstance and the situation that we are finding ourselves in that present moment, versus letting that anger get to a level that the emotion is now in control versus us being in control of the emotion. This is a subject that is really special to me, and I think everything I talk about on this podcast has a meaning to me. That's why I'm here, right? But this is a subject that I wanted to dive into today because this last year I have been doing a lot of work around going towards and understanding my anger when I feel it versus shying away from it and telling myself that it is something that I shouldn't feel and it is an emotion that I should avoid. Because, again, I feel like I can address the elephant in the room and speak for myself and a lot of people when I say that 2020 and 2021 have been extremely difficult times for all of us in unique and individual ways. With COVID-19, we've all been forced to follow very strict laws, and we've been prevented from seeing the people we love and traveling to the people we love and having to stay in our homes for what feels like now has been forever. But in addition to that, to add to that really, because a lot of these things happened in the midst of each other, this last year we've seen the rise of news stories and media headlines and video footage of the Black Lives Matter movement as a result of the horrible police brutality that has been happening in the United States. And right now, as many of you know, there is a war, a terrible humanitarian crisis happening in Palestine. I think that after all the events of this year and being exposed to the things that have been, lurking underneath the surface, because racism and discrimination and war and violence are things that have always been a part of human culture, but have not received the adequate amount of media coverage and have not had a lot of conversation contributed to them because it is uncomfortable, right? And it puts us in a place in which we have to face and accept that humans are capable of such malignancies, and it's horrible to think and to watch. But I think this year has been very exemplary of the fact that it's necessary, and we have to be willing to engage in conversation. We have to be willing to go inside and do the work within ourselves and externally, not just on Instagram by like reading a couple threads and posting things on your story, but going beyond that and reading tangible articles and listening to the voices of the people who are part of the marginalized groups that are being oppressed, and seeking to understand what they are trying to say and how we can best help them receive the equality and equity that they deserve. And at the same time, it's not easy, right, to read these difficult things and have these difficult conversations and see people who are at their worst because they have been violated by the oppressor, right? And I think that the media is a very toxic place right now because it is putting a lot of people against each other. I don't think that the online community is a very welcoming space right now. I think that it has become aggressive and critical, but at the same time putting people against each other and trying to force people into the movement and into allyship using aggression and criticism is causing tension between people, right? You guys have heard me talk about this on past episodes. Criticism drives people against each other, not towards each other. And that being said, it is causing anger to build up within us because we don't want to be called out for a mistake, and we don't want to be seen as an oppressor. We want to be seen as part of the movement, but you know, we make mistakes, and there's just so much information that is so widespread. But anyways, all this to say that it's been a year of a lot of anger for a lot of people, I think. And for me personally, after seeing, you know, the murder of George Floyd on television and hearing about Breonna Taylor, and now seeing the Palestinian movement manifest itself, and just all the things that have been shown to us this year, I think for me, understanding my anger and going towards it and understanding what it is trying to tell me has been a very healing practice of mine. And I've done this through multiple ways, through meditation, through journaling, through conversation with myself and with others. But I think it's very necessary for us to understand ourselves and to understand our values and our beliefs. And I think without anger, humanity would be way less passionate. And I don't think that it is an emotion that should be shied away from because we think that it is, you know, taboo and scary and aggressive, but rather anger is a series of signposts that are showing us in the direction of our beliefs and our values. And anger is an emotion that highlights the things that we believe in and the things that we most value and the things that hurt us and violate us because they are going against something that we believe and or value. So say belief and or value one more time, Mariana. But I hope you guys like this episode and that it serves you and helps you not fear your anger so much. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So first, let's start off by defining what anger is. Anger is an emotional response towards people and circumstances that we perceive as having thrown us off balance, off of our intended course of action. Anger is an emotion that is part of the fight or flight response, and you guys have heard me talk about the fight or flight response on the podcast before, but for those of you that don't know, in brief, it is the sympathetic nervous system's response towards a perceived threat. And because our body doesn't discriminate between a lion chasing us and someone having accidentally bumped into us, causing us to spill coffee on our shirt, this response is uniform across all stressors. And whenever we think of anger, we think of the negative and unpleasant internal feelings that we get when we feel angry, like our heart rate going up, our blood pressure going up, our stomach feeling woozy, and just like feeling the anxiety that comes with anger. And all of those negative, unpleasant feelings that we get when we're angry are because of this response. And fun fact, the reason why a lot of people tend to act out and do things that they probably wouldn't normally do in a steady state when they're angry is because during our fight or flight response, our brain directs blood flow and energy towards body parts and body mechanisms that we need to be able to survive. So it directs more blood flow towards our muscles so we can run away, for example. And in doing so, it pulls blood away from the frontal cortex of our brain, which is responsible for decision making. And that is why a lot of times people who are angry don't respond in the way that they probably would, and they do things that are very not them. So there's a little fun fact for you there. When we think of anger, we perceive it as aggression, sensitivity, irrationality, all of the negative associations that we have been taught to associate with anger. And I don't know about you guys, but for me personally, when I was younger and I was angry, my parents would send me to my room and tell me that I couldn't come out until I was happy again, right? And I think that because anger is something that we've been taught to shy away from, we feel like we shouldn't feel it. And we automatically think that when we're angry, we need to do everything possible to downregulate ourselves to be positive again, because it's just something that shouldn't naturally be felt if we are good, positive people. When in reality, anger is something we all feel, and it is very, very hard to avoid it at all costs, because people and things and circumstances are going to cause you to fall off balance very often. And anger is necessary, as I've said already, to understand ourselves and understand what boundaries are being crossed so that we can either make adjustments to them, adapt them, or make them clear. Common circumstances in which we find ourselves feeling angry is when someone does something that goes against our values, when someone breaks our trust, when they cross a boundary of ours, or when they do something that goes against what we ask them to do. We also feel anger when our circumstances don't go as expected. So maybe you plan to go out with your friends on a picnic on a sunny day, but you wake up the next morning and it's actually raining, so you can't. Or we feel angry when something that we are passionate about is devalued or undermined by somebody else. And these are just some common examples that I could think of. I'm sure that there are thousands more. We can make a whole episode on reasons why we feel angry. But as you're listening to this right now, I want you to think back to a time when you felt extremely angry. Think about how you felt, why you felt that way, and how you responded. And if you're looking back now wishing that you had responded a different way. If you are, that is okay. I don't want you to sit there judging yourself, because that's not what we're here to do. We are here to navigate this together. So if there has been a time in which you responded a certain way and now you're wishing you hadn't, I want you to keep that thought in mind and that memory in mind as we go through this episode, so that you can understand what that anger was and why it led you to respond the way you did. So before we get into the practical tactics that I've outlined here and collected here to help us navigate our anger, I want to give a really brilliant analogy that Glennon Doyle gave in her book Untamed, which, as those of you who have been here for a while listening to the podcast, you'll know that I've been reading the book, and I actually just finished it. And in one of her chapters, and really this chapter was a really big motivator towards creating this episode for you guys today, was that in this particular chapter, she talked about anger and how she navigated her anger and how she came to terms with her anger. And I won't give away her full story, but for those of you that don't know, Glennon Doyle was married to a man and had 3 children with her ex-husband before divorcing him to marry her current wife, Abby Wambach. And her husband was unfortunately unfaithful to her during their marriage, but she didn't want to leave because she thought it was her duty as a mother to stay for her children. And this book goes into how she overcame that, but in this particular chapter, she talks about a time in which she was sitting across from her husband on their couch, and all she could do was glare at him because she couldn't understand how he was so at peace with himself. He had apologized to her, and they'd had several conversations about him cheating, but obviously she still held a lot of resentment towards him. And she talks about how she found herself just glaring at him and not understanding how he could just be so okay even after the apology. And in that moment, she had a realization in which she realized that the anger that she was holding and projecting onto him wasn't at him, but at herself. She discovered that she was actually angry at the fact that she was staying in the marriage when she knew that it was her right to walk away if it didn't serve her anymore. And through this realization, she was able to kind of zoom out and look at her and her ex-husband from a third-person perspective and see the situation as a whole and gain an understanding as to why she was feeling this way. And when she understood her anger, she was able to take the step towards converting that anger into a proactive action, which turned into her divorcing him, marrying the woman she loved, and writing this incredible book. So if that isn't a good example of how anger can serve you, I don't know what is. She describes anger as being the deliverer of a package that contains a belief of ours that is being challenged in that situation. So when I was telling you guys about Glennon finding herself sitting across the couch from her ex-husband and glaring at him and just not understanding why she felt all this anger towards him, she realized that she was actually holding anger towards herself for not leaving, and she couldn't understand why. So she dug deep, and she realized that in that moment, the package that was being delivered to her by her anger was that she was angry because she felt like she needed to stay in the marriage because as a mother and as a woman, that is her responsibility. You sacrifice your life for your children, and you are complacent with your situation, and you keep quiet, and you just find gratitude in whatever possible, because that is what society has told women is their role on this earth, is to just be complacent and conform to the situation. So that deep-rooted belief, she realized, was driving that anger because she wanted to break free of it, and she didn't believe that for herself. She wanted to become free of it and instead live a life of love and freedom and, go marry the woman that she loved, which was Abby. So she chose to, in that moment, send that package away and return it, and instead create a new definition for herself of what love meant and what dedication meant and what devotion meant and what women's role in society really is, which is completely different from the traditional ideologies that we have all been fed. So I absolutely loved that analogy because I think it's so exemplary of how we can use anger to help us understand ourselves, but also how much of the anger that we feel is due to unnoticed and subconscious beliefs that we hold. And when we are able to use our anger to acknowledge that their presence and break free of the beliefs that don't serve us anymore, that is when we can really evolve. So, whenever we feel angry, anger tells us four key things. Anger highlights a belief that we have about a person. It highlights a belief that we have about ourselves, a belief about the situation, and or a belief that was unconsciously instilled in us. So, unconscious beliefs, very similar to the example that I just gave of Glennon there. She was able to untame herself from the ideology that women are complacent beings, when in reality, women should have full autonomy over their decisions and their life. A belief about the situation could be the one I highlighted earlier about the picnic going wrong due to the weather. So a lot of times we set very strong expectations about how a situation should go according to how we want it to go. And when we set that unconscious expectation and things don't go as planned, our ego gets so hurt, and that turns into anger manifesting itself. And that anger is highlighting that expectation that we set that we probably shouldn't have set, and really it's showing us that we probably should have been prepared for a change in the weather and made a backup plan. So a belief about ourselves includes, I think, very similar to what I also talked about with Glennon there. She believed that as a mother, her role was to stay for her children, and that she was incapable of leaving the marriage because it would hurt her children. And she was able to break free of that and redefine herself and her purpose as a mother. And the first one I mentioned, belief we have about a person, that one is very unique and individual to everybody, and it manifests itself differently within everybody. But what I really want to highlight about this one is that when anger delivers a package to us about a belief or an expectation that we have about a person, it can project itself the wrong way, because when we don't recognize that we are holding a belief about a person, about how they should act, how they should treat us, how they should be in a relationship or a friendship, etc., and they themselves are not cognizant of that belief of ours, it can lead us to act out towards that person for reasons that we don't understand, and it can really throw the person sideways because they don't understand why you're lashing out at them. So it's very important to, in any relationship, define your boundaries and your expectations with another person so that they are open, they are out there for them and for yourself to understand, so that they don't become these deep-rooted and subconscious beliefs that, when they are challenged, cause you to have tension towards a person. So, now to get into the addressing of the anger and how to work with your anger and work with your response to your anger to serve you versus responding in a way that you ideally wouldn't want to, there's a few steps that I'm going to highlight for you here. So the first one, as with any time you are faced with a stressor, the very first thing to do is to breathe. However long it takes you to downregulate yourself back to your steady state, get that heart rate down, get that blood pressure back down, remove the steam from the ears, just breathe until you feel like you are ready to address the situation. And in that moment, make a note of the sensations that you're feeling so you can better understand them and understand where they're coming from and what they're trying to tell you. Because a lot of times they can be really immature responses, and they can be rooted from our ego. And a lot of us know that our ego is like the inner child, and it just throws a tantrum every single time things don't go its way or the way that it expects them to. So zooming out of the situation and watching it from a third-party perspective is huge, and it also allows you to create distance between yourself and the emotion. Something that is really important to understand is that we are not our thoughts, and we are not governed by our thoughts. And when we learn to create space between ourselves and a thought and not associate with ourselves with that thought, we learn to stop letting those emotions dictate us and tell us who we are. So the next time you're feeling angry, try not to say, I am angry, right? Because then you subconsciously tell yourself that you are this angry, negative person, when in reality, anger is just an emotion that you're feeling. So the next time you are frustrated or down, try to tell yourself, I notice that I'm feeling angry, versus associating the emotion directly to yourself so that you don't then go and sabotage yourself by creating this negative notion about who you are, which is completely independent of the emotion itself. Step 3 is to get to the root of what is making you angry. And again, I have some examples here, but we could go on about this forever. So some examples that I have here is that left their shoes in the doorway and you've tripped over them. A lot of times anger is compound interest, and it is anger that has accumulated itself over various instances of somebody crossing a line that they shouldn't have crossed. Is it because you're having an off day? Try to think back to if you got enough sleep that night, if you had your coffee in the morning, or if something happened prior to this instance that is really the thing that is making you angsty, and it is now manifesting itself as anger towards this other thing. So maybe you spilled coffee on your shirt that morning and it was a brand new white shirt, and that was what really made you mad, but now you're acting out against your partner for something minimal that really shouldn't be a piece of argument, but now is because now you are upset from this other thing. Is it because your brain is resisting? This one is a little bit harder to zone in on, but our brains, as I've said on the podcast before, our brains are wired to seek comfort. And as soon as we do something that forces us to be uncomfortable and to step outside our comfort zone, our brain is going to resist and do anything and everything possible to avoid that extra energy expenditure that comes with getting uncomfortable. So say you wake up one day and you had committed to going to the gym at 6 o'clock in the morning, you wake up at 5:30 and your brain is just doing anything and everything in its power to tell you to go back to bed, and it's trying to convince you that it's not worth it, or that you're going to do it later, or you can try again tomorrow. A lot of our times, our brain resisting discomfort leads to this accumulation of anger because we then get into a tussle with our brain and our thoughts. Our thoughts are telling us, don't go, stay home, get back in bed. But the intention side of us that committed to doing this one thing is telling us to go forth and do it because we committed. And when these go back and forth, fighting against each other and trying to win, a lot of times that becomes anger. So ask yourself if the anger that you're feeling is your brain just going on default mode and seeking comfort over discomfort, and then try to be objective about the thoughts that your brain is screaming at you and acknowledge that they are not you and they are not the intention side of you that committed to doing this thing. It is just your default wiring, biological default wiring telling you to not go and expend energy. The last example I have here is ask yourself if the root of your anger is if an insecurity of yours is being touched. And this one is very sensitive and probably the hardest piece of anger to address because none of us like to admit to others or to ourselves that we have insecurities, right? But insecurities are a normal part of the human experience, and we all feel them, and sometimes they get touched by someone or something, and that triggers us, and that natural defense mechanism elicits itself as anger. So the next time someone or something prods at an inner insecurity of yours and you start feeling on edge and you start getting defensive, try to acknowledge that, because understand that your insecurities don't define you. And as uncomfortable as it can be when somebody touches a part of us that is sensitive and that is easily hurt, it only serves to highlight what things about ourselves we can work on to overcome those negative thought patterns and break free of that insecurity ultimately. Number 5 is to ask yourself what the immediate action that you can take is. So there's 2 paths to this one. Depending on your current circumstance, you can either take immediate action. So in the example of the picnic, you can either stay there and sulk about the fact that it rained instead of being sunny like you planned, or you can get everyone together and say, okay, we are going to relocate and we're going to do this at a restaurant, or we can all come over to our house. Can you act right away and find an instant remedy to the situation so that you can reverse the outcome? If the answer is yes, as Nike would say, just do it. The second option, obviously, is that there isn't a way to respond immediately. And this prolonged response can take on many forms. There's very unique and individual circumstances, of course. An example is perhaps you overheard about a friend who told somebody else a secret that you asked them to keep, and now you're very angry in this moment and you recognize that you have to go and talk to this person afterwards, right? That is a prolonged response because you cannot respond immediately. It's probably not in your best interest to respond immediately because you are in a heightened state. So you have to kind of hold on to that anger and then go talk to them, right? Or maybe you just had a fight with your spouse, or you came home and your spouse forgot to do this one thing that you asked for them, and now you have to wait to tell them until they get home. Those are some examples of prolonged responses in which you have to kind of hold on to the anger before releasing it in the form of a discussion. But the kind of practical, I guess those are also practical examples, but the example that I really wanted to get into today is when you see an injustice that causes anger within you. So, I think a lot of us, unfortunately, witnessed the murdering of George Floyd on live TV last year multiple times. The video was broadcasted, and that caused me to become very angry because, again, as I mentioned before, it's accepting that humans are capable of such injustices and such aggression and such hate. And I'm talking about the police officers when I say that. And then we heard about Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud, and now what's happening in Palestine, and with COVID, all of the anti-Asian hate that has just spiked a ridiculous percentage in the last couple months. And seeing these things and seeing vulnerable and innocent people get hurt obviously stimulates an anger response within us, because we want to protect these people and we see these things as injustices, for those of us that can think rationally, obviously. But we see these injustices and we acknowledge that nobody deserves this kind of treatment. And so when we feel this anger, if addressed correctly, we can use it to take action in a way that is proactive and not reactive. And what I mean by this is when we fully understand the scope of what that anger is telling us, and in this case, it could be that we don't stand for racism, and we don't stand for discrimination, and we don't stand for hate. When we fully understand that we don't stand for those things and why, because they go against our values. We value respect, we value integrity, we value kindness, we value compassion. When we acknowledge that that anger is telling us that those values are being violated, then we can devise an adequate response to address the problem in a way that is not critical or aggressive. Because I think that when we see videos like this that just make us angry and make us feel the hate towards the people that inflicted another person with pain, it's very hard to not just drop into the comment section and just call those people out and call them names and, all of the things that we would want to do versus doing the things that we should do. Because I want to stress that it is very normal to want to hop into the comment section and just insult the oppressors and be angry at them and call them out for what they did. And that's natural, right? I have felt it. We've all felt that, right? And it takes a lot of grit and maturity and self-control not to. And again, I think I'm touching on some topics that I've touched on other podcast episodes before, but when we respond, when we let our anger guide the response, it's going to elicit itself in ways that we wouldn't want to come off across as. Because I know that I would never call any of my friends a racist or a homophobe or a murderer before sitting down with them and asking them why they acted out a way they did, if they acted out a certain way. And I think when we take that approach towards things and circumstances that make us angry as well, and understand that, we are victims of victims. A lot of people act in ways that they think are right because they have been tamed to think they are right. A lot of people act out of anger because they aren't going towards it and trying to understand what their anger is telling them, right? The police officers who murdered George Floyd arguably murdered him out of anger because they saw Black people as a threat, because that is what Black people have been painted as by the media. And again, I'm not justifying Derek Chauvin or any of the officers that were involved in his murder, but what I'm trying to say is that never has responding with aggression and criticism led to a solution. When we project our anger through compassion and through kindness and through passion, through going to protest and through writing about issues in the community and through donating to charities and through uplifting the voices of our community members who are oppressed and helping them achieve equality and equity and get what they deserve, when we use anger as a vector for passion and for our values to project themselves, that is how anger becomes a proactive tool and a proactive emotional tool that we can use to ultimately change the world, I think. But so to summarize all of that, I hope that all made sense. I got really passionate there, but in brief, you're allowed to feel angry, and anger will unconditionally always highlight the parts about you that are most you, that are being violated or that are being challenged. And when you really take a second, and when you really take the time between the stimulus and the response to devise a response that is true from you and from the heart, to acknowledge and address a situation, when you choose to project anger through love and through compassion instead of through aggression and criticism and hate, that is where anger becomes incredibly powerful and arguably one of the greatest tools that humanity has been given as an emotion to highlight for us what needs to be changed in the world and within us. And the last point I want to give here about anger and addressing our anger is that the next time you feel angry towards another person or another group of people, the best healing action that you can take for yourself is to forgive the person or the people that did you or somebody else wrong. It's not an immediate action that you can take, certainly, but it is one of those prolonged responses that are going to lead to your peace. Because at the end of the day, the other person is not going to benefit from knowing that you forgave them, right? The only person that is going to serve is you. And so when you choose to use other people's hate to motivate you to create change in yourself and within your community, forgive them, but don't condemn them. Like I said before, we are all victims of victims, and it is okay to find drive and determination to change and for change within the words of hate of others, but it is when we attach our worth or our purpose to showing them up that it becomes toxic and unhealthy. You are not better than anyone, and nobody is better than you, right? Like, we all learned that in kindergarten, and it's so true. So you are totally allowed to internalize the things that have been said to you, about somebody else, and acknowledge them, and acknowledge that they've made you angry, and acknowledge that you want to prove those opinions wrong, but acknowledge that those words are products of beliefs, they are products of unconscious beliefs, and they are products of jealousy and hate that people hold within them that a lot of times really isn't their fault. And yes, use them to fuel you and your actions and your purpose, but do so diligently and do so through love and through compassion and through kindness. That is all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of A Perspective. I hope that information was helpful, and I hope that the next time you feel angry, you go towards your anger versus shying away from it, because it is a valid emotion. You are allowed to feel it, and you are encouraged to feel it now that you know that it is a signpost and it is only delivering a package that is meant to show you an internalized belief that you may not even know you have. So, thank you guys so much for tuning in again to another episode. If you wouldn't mind dropping a rating, dropping a comment on Apple Podcasts or Spotify so this can reach more people, that would be greatly appreciated. But other than that, thank you so much for all your support, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.